In the black heart of Ravenbrook Woods, where the wind moaned through twisted pines and the storm raged like a living thing, a woman and her two little girls stumbled forward, searching desperately for safety. The rain lashed down in sheets, blinding and bitter, soaking through their thin clothes until the fabric clung like ice. Lightning cracked above, revealing shadows that seemed to lunge from every tree, and thunder shook the ground under their boots. Behind them lay only darkness and danger, but ahead, though they did not yet know it, waited the cabin that the people of Ravenbrook had whispered about for years. A place no one dared to approach. A place said to belong to a ghost of a man, a hermit who burned a lantern through the night to hold back spirits no one dared to name. Clara Martin gripped her daughter's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened, her shawl plastered against her shoulders, her body trembling with both cold and fatigue. She was only 34, yet her face already bore the quiet weariness of someone who had carried too many burdens. Widowhood had carved lines of grief into her skin, and her hazel eyes, soft once, now darted sharply at every sound in the forest, as if expecting threats to step from the shadows. Her brown hair, bound into a loose bun, was streaked across her pale cheeks by the storm. She pressed on because she had no other choice. Her children needed her to. Hazel and Ivy, the 8-year-old twins who clung at her side, mirrored one another in form if not in spirit. Hazel, born only minutes first, had the stubborn lift of chin and restless courage of a child who wanted to protect but did not yet understand danger fully. Her honey-blonde ponytail stuck to her damp cheek, and her denim dress, once cheerful, was plastered to yellow leggings streaked with mud. Ivy, softer, gentler, leaned into her sister with every step, shivering beneath her soaked pink tutu and faded unicorn shirt. Each crack of thunder sent her eyes wide, her lips whispering prayers only she could hear. Together they pressed close, trembling but unbroken. Walking just ahead of them was Ranger, their German shepherd, soaked to the skin but steady as a soldier. His black and tan coat bristled with tension, ears erect, nose lifted as he sniffed every gust of the storm's air. Ranger had once been her late husband's patrol companion, trained to guard, to guide, to warn. Even in his weariness, his low growls rippled through the clearing like thunder beneath thunder. To Clara, Ranger was not only a protector, he was the last living tie to her husband's strength. Tonight those low growls told her something was wrong, something ahead was not what it seemed. The narrow path through the woods spat them into a clearing. And there, crouched among weeds and thorny brush, loomed the cabin. Its gray planks sagged, warped by years of storms and neglect. The roof drooped like a weary beast bowing its head, and the porch groaned under the weight of its own decay. Most of its windows stared back at them with lifeless black eyes, except one. At the far end, a single window glowed, casting a steady golden light into the storm. Clara froze. Her children pressed against her skirt, their breaths quick clouds. In the icy air, Ranger's body stiffened, his amber eyes locked on the glowing window, a deep growl rolling through his chest like a drumbeat of warning. "Mom," Ivy whispered, her voice tiny, trembling. "Someone's in there." Clara's heart thudded painfully. Instinct told her to turn back. The cabin was a place of whispers, of warnings. The townsfolk had always called it cursed. They told stories in hushed tones of the hermit who lived there, a man no longer a man but a shadow, a ghost in human skin. But her daughter's shivering bodies left her with no choice. They needed a roof, a fire, anything to keep them alive until morning. She bent down, brushing wet strands of hair from Ivy's pale forehead. "It's only for tonight," she murmured softly, steadying her own voice, though inside she trembled. "We'll knock, and if it isn't safe, we'll leave." Hazel's eyes sparkled with a mix of fear and excitement. "What if it's haunted?" she whispered, half teasing, half terrified. Clara forced a thin smile but said nothing. Ranger's growl deepened, vibrating through the leash in her hand. She squeezed it tighter, knuckles pale. Haunted or not, safe or not, they could not turn back. While Clara and her daughters stood at the cabin's edge, Ravenbrook itself carried on with its whispers. In the neon glow of the diner downtown, two farmers leaned over chipped mugs of coffee. "They say he screams at night," one muttered, "like a man wrestling ghosts." His companion nodded. Silas Granger, that medic from the war. Never right in the head since he came back. Keeps a light burning to scare off spirits. Folks call him the Mad Hermit. The waitress rolled her eyes but leaned closer, lowering her voice. "My mother said never to go near that place. Last winter, a hunter vanished. They all blamed him. The cabin had long been more than wood and nails. It was a canvas painted with the town's fears, easier to imagine a monster than admit a man might simply be lonely. And in the sheriff's office, miles away, Sheriff Miles O'Connor scratched notes into his pad. In his 50s, broad-shouldered salt-and-pepper hair cropped close, his face wore the tired lines of a man who had seen more despair than hope. Reports had come again of a light in the cabin window. He didn't believe in curses, but he knew. Every rumor carried some seed of truth. "Keep an eye on it," he ordered his deputy, snapping his notebook shut. Calm on the outside, restless on the inside, Miles did not fear the hermit, but he feared what isolation could drive a man to do. Back at the clearing, Clara stood rooted, rain dripping down her brow, legs heavy as stone. Hazel and Ivy clutched each other, Ranger bristling at their side, hackles raised like knives. Each step toward the cabin felt heavier, echoing louder against the roaring storm. The weeds clawed at their legs. The porch sagged ominously under Clara's weight as she placed her foot on the first step. The golden light flickered, as though it sensed their presence. She raised her hand and knocked. The sound was hollow, almost, swallowed by the storm, but it carried. Hazel tightened her grip on Ivy's hand. Ranger's growl grew low, taut as a bowstring. Then, movement. A chair scraped inside, boots dragged against the wood floor. The door creaked open, just a crack, spilling golden lamplight across the porch. In the frame stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, but slightly stooped, his frame lean from years of survival, not comfort. His jaw was square, his stubble thick, his hair dark streaked with silver. His storm-gray eyes were tired, vigilant, lined with memories too heavy to forget. Silas Granger. His expression was carved in irritation, the scowl of someone who had lived too long alone. "What?" he barked, voice rough, gravelly from silence, scraping like stone across metal. Clara straightened, pushing down her fear. "Please," she said, her words shivering in the cold. "My daughters. We need shelter from the storm, just until morning." Silas's eyes swept over them, the soaked children trembling, clinging to their mother, then to Ranger, whose growl deepened, protectively. "Dogs don't belong here," he muttered, though the sharpness in his voice faltered. For a flicker of a moment, something human shone in his gaze. "You can leave the mud outside," he grumbled, but it lacked conviction. Hazel tugged at Ranger's leash, speaking quickly, her voice trembling. "He won't hurt anyone. He just doesn't like the rain." Silas stared, unmoving. Then, at last, he sighed, heavy and tired, as if wrestling himself. He pulled the door open wider, golden light spilling across their faces. "Fine," he said at last, voice low but firm. "Get in before you freeze." Inside was another world. Clara gasped softly. The cabin's outer decay had suggested ruin, but the interior gleamed with a soldier's precision. Honey-cold wood panels lined the walls, glowing in lamplight. A stone fireplace crackled at the far end, its heat filling the air with the rich aroma of burning cedar. The floorboards were polished to a dull sheen, swept free of dust. Tools hung neatly from pegs, each in its appointed place. Hazel's eyes widened. It's beautiful," she whispered, though she quickly hushed herself under her mother's warning glance. Silas closed the door with a heavy thud and turned to face them. He crossed his arms over his chest. The fabric of his faded flannel shirt stretched tight across wiry muscle. "Don't touch anything," he said sharply. Clara ushered the girls toward the fire, kneeling to rub warmth back into their frozen arms. Ranger shook himself, scattering droplets across the floor. Silas's frown deepened, but he said nothing, only moved to the mantel where he adjusted a lamp. The light glowed brighter, its golden hue casting shadows that danced across the beams. Hazel, curious as ever, glanced at the lamp. "Why do you keep the light on, mister? The rest of the windows are dark, but that one." Her words died under Silas's sudden stare. His eyes flashed, not with anger, but with something harder to name. Fear, perhaps, or memory. "It stays on," he said curtly. "Old habit keeps the nightmares at bay." His voice dropped lower. "Final. That's all you need to know." Clara placed a firm hand on Hazel's shoulder, pulling her back. "Thank you for letting us in," she said softly, offering a thin smile. "We'll be gone by morning," Silas grunted, moving toward a wooden chair by the fire. He lowered himself into it with the ease of ritual, hands braced against his knees. His movements were deliberate, practiced, like a soldier who had built rhythm into every action to fend off chaos. Meanwhile, in the heart of Ravenbrook, the rain beat against the windows of Henderson's general store. Inside, the aisle stood half empty, jars and sacks shifted with a hurried look. Mr. Henderson himself, spectacles fogged from the damp, muttered as he checked the back room. "Gone again," he grumbled. Flour sacks lighter than they should be, a row of canned beans missing. For weeks, stock had vanished in small amounts, but now the pattern was undeniable. At the gas station across town, a mechanic found his truck pried. Open, fuel siphoned off in the night. "Who'd steal gas in a storm like this?" he demanded, holding the broken cap in his hand. The answer, whispered across the tavern and cafe alike, was unanimous: the hermit. Who else could it be? One farmer insisted, his face red from drink. "He hides out in that cabin, skulking around the woods, always a light burning. It's him." Their voices rose, feeding off each other's suspicion. Sheriff Miles Ockenor listened from the corner booth of the diner, arms folded across his chest. His deputy, a thin young man named Daniels, slid into the seat opposite him, shaking rain from his hat. "2 more reports tonight," Daniel said. "Food. Missing from the mill storage and the gas theft." Miles sighed, his mustache twitching, his face, weathered and stern, softened only slightly under the lamplight. "Rumors are running hotter than the stove back there," he muttered. "People will want a name to blame, and Granger's too easy a target." "You think it's not him?" Daniels asked cautiously. "I think a man who came back from war broken enough to lock himself away isn't stealing beans and gasoline," Miles replied. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. The hermit had always been an unknown, and unknowns were dangerous. He tapped his pen against the edge of the table. "Still, I'll look into it myself. I want to know for certain." He stood, pulling his coat tight, eyes narrowing toward the rain-streaked windows where the forest loomed beyond. Back in the cabin, silence reigned, broken only by the crackle of fire and the steady drip of rain from their clothes onto the floorboards. Hazel and Ivy leaned against their mother, finally starting to relax. Ranger settled at their feet, though his eyes remained fixed on Silas, watchful and untrusting. Silas, for his part, stared into the fire as though it were the only living thing in the room. His thoughts were locked behind a fortress of habit and scars. Yet, As the storm raged outside, the hermit had allowed strangers into his world, however reluctantly, and the golden light in the window, once a warning to the town, now glowed over a fragile, uneasy truce. Morning broke reluctantly over Ravenbrook Woods, a pale gray light that filtered through the pines and bled across the clearing. The storm had passed, leaving the world hushed and dripping. Mist hung in lazy curls between the trees and the cabins. Tin roof pinged faintly as water slid down its ridges. Inside, Clara stirred the embers in the fireplace, while her daughters whispered nearby. Hazel and Ivy, warmed by dry blankets Silas had provided with begrudging mutters, were at last able to let curiosity replace fear. Ranger sprawled near the hearth, his dark coat gleaming damply, his sharp eyes never straying too far from Silas, who sat in his chair with the stiff posture of a man accustomed to waiting for orders that no longer came. It was Hazel who noticed first. As Silas reached to adjust a lamp on the mantel, his sleeve fell back, revealing a lattice of pale scars crisscrossing his forearm. Some were long and ragged, others neat and surgical. She nudged Ivy with a small gasp. The younger twin's eyes widened. "Mr. Granger," Hazel said cautiously, "what happened to your arm?" Silas froze. For a heartbeat, his entire body seemed to stiffen as though memory had pinned him to the chair. His eyes, those storm-gray sentinels, flicked to the girls. Clara opened her mouth to hush her daughter, but Silas lifted a hand. "It's fine," he said at last, voice low, carrying the grit of gravel. He pulled his sleeve back further, exposing the full canvas of scars, not only on his forearm but crawling up toward his elbow. "These reminders," the twins leaned closer, wide-eyed, and even Ranger lifted his head as though listening. Silas's gaze drifted past them, settling somewhere only he could see. "I was a medic once. Military. My hands patched wounds, stopped bleeding, stitched skin back together. But the truth is, you can't save everyone. No matter how fast you work, no matter how many times you gamble against the clock, sometimes you lose." His voice trembled, softened, by memory. "Those scars, they're not all mine. Some are from battles, yes, but most are from my own doing. My way of punishing these hands for failing. Men trusted me. They died anyway." Ivy swallowed hard. "But you did save some, didn't you?" Silas blinked. A shadow of a smile ghosted his lips. Weary but real. "Yes. Some walked away because of what I did. A few went home. A few hugged their children again. That's the part I hold on to when the night tries to steal my sleep." Ranger gave Asmal huff, not the growl of suspicion, but the sigh of recognition. Slowly he pushed himself to his feet, patted over and sniffed Silas's scarred hand. The hermit's rough fingers hesitated, then lowered to scratch, behind the shepherd's ears. For the first time since Clara had stepped into the cabin, the air shifted, the faintest thread of trust forming. Clara, watching from her seat by the fire, saw something beyond scars and bitterness. She saw the discipline in how he arranged his tools, the restraint in how he spoke, the lingering tenderness when he looked at their children. He was a man haunted, yes, but not hollow. There was a heart buried beneath the wreckage. In the town of Ravenbrook, the whispers thickened. "Sheriff." Miles O'Connor stood in the dim back office of the station, a steaming mug of black coffee cradled between scarred hands. His deputy, Daniels, had returned from a late patrol with news. "There have been sightings," Daniel said, shaking rain from his jacket. "Two men, Caleb and Roy Danner. Brothers, they've been camping somewhere near the northern ridge. Folks swear they've seen lanterns moving through the trees." Miles frowned. The name was not new to him. Caleb and Roy were well known across county lines. Lean, restless men with reputations carved from theft and intimidation. Both in their 40s, Caleb the elder with narrow eyes and a wolfish grin that never reached them. Roy Thicker, set with a perpetual scowl etched into his square jaw. They had once been caught running lumber out of government land, chainsaws howling where no logging was allowed. Another time, it was crates of liquor hidden under tarps, smuggled across county lines. Each time, they'd slip through with short sentences or fines, never long enough to stop. "What are they after this time?" Miles asked, his voice flat. Could be lumber, could be fuel. Henderson swears the missing supplies match their style. Small bites. Regular, just enough to stay hidden. Miles set down his mug, the weight of duty pressing onto his shoulders. "And what do people say?" Daniels hesitated. "They think Grares is mixed up in it. They say he's giving the brother shelter in that cabin of his. Every time something goes missing, folks mutter about that light in the woods. You know how it is." The sheriff let out a slow sigh. He had spent years trying to temper rumor with reason, but fear was louder than truth. "Keep your ears open," he said. "If the Danners are here, I'll deal with them myself." As for Granger, his gaze drifted to the rain, slick window, to the silhouette of the forest beyond. "I'll find out where he stands soon enough." Back at the cabin, the rain eased into silence. Hazel and Ivy sat cross-legged by the fire, clutching the small wooden carvings Silas had reluctantly given them from a shelf. Oni a hawk, the other a bear. Their innocent chatter filled the room, a balm against the ghosts that pressed against its walls. Clara sat with a quiet gratitude, though unease still stirred. She had not missed the way Silas's eyes sometimes unfocused, as if watching something far away, something violent, something only he could see. When he blinked back, there lingered a haunted softness, the expression of a man who had once carried dying men in his arms. Yet, as she watched Ranger lean into Silas's rough palm, Clara thought she could believe what she had seen in those storm-gay eyes. A spark of humanity not yet extinguished. The night returned with a hush of falling mist. The storm had moved on, but its remnants lingered. A soaked forest floor, branches bowed under, the weight of rain and the steady drip of water from the cabin's sagging porch roof. Inside, the fire had dimmed to embers, painting the room with a red-orange glow. Hazel and Ivy lay curled beneath wool blankets, their breathing even and slow. Clara sat in the armchair opposite Silas, her gaze drawn to the slow movements of his scarred hands as he sharpened a small hunting knife against a wet stone. He said little assleways, yet the rhythm of stone against steel was oddly reassuring. Ranger dozed at the foot of the bed, chest rising and falling in patient cadence. It was Ivy who woke first. She sat upright with a sharp breath, small fingers clutching the blanket. The sound was faint, but distinct. A shuffle, a snap of twigs somewhere beyond the walls. Her wide eyes darted to the darkened window. "Mama," she whispered, her voice quivering. "Something's out there." Before Clara could stir, RER's ear spike cricked. The German shepherd lifted his head, teeth bared, a low growl thrumming from his chest. A moment later, he barked, loud, sudden, violent. Hazel jerked awake. Silas was on his feet instantly. Knife in hand, he crossed the room with the precision of habit, sliding the blade into his belt. "Stay with them," he ordered Clara, voice firm and level. He opened the door, and cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the smell of pine and wet earth. But Clara rose too, determination etched into her face. "I'm coming." She pulled her coat around her and stepped into the night. Ranger surged ahead, nose to the ground, hackles bristling as he circled the clearing. The two adults followed, lantern light sweeping across the mud. That was when they saw them. Clear, deep impressions of boots pressed into the softened earth. Fresh, too fresh. They circled the cabin, some leading from the tree-ine, others vanishing back into it. Clara's breath hitched. "These aren't tours," she whispered, her pulse racing. Her eyes swept the shadows between the trees, half expecting shapes to emerge. Silas crouched, fingers brushing the prints. His expression tightened, mouth pulling into a grim line. "Two men," he murmured. Heavy set, one drags his heel. "They've been watching." Clara's hands trembled against the lantern handle. "We're not alone out here." Ranger barked sharply toward the woods, the sound slicing through the stillness, but nothing answered. No human voice, no animal rustle, only the dripping of water and the pounding of Clara's heart. "Back inside," Silas said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. He ushered Clara toward the porch. Ranger closed behind, though the dog's eyes never left the forest. Inside, Hazel clung to her sister. Evie's face was pale, lips trembling. Clara pulled them close, whispering reassurances, even as her own fear gnawed at her. Silas stood by the door, lantern extinguished, knife at his side. His jaw was set, his eyes dark with a soldier's knowledge. Footprints meant intruders, and intruders meant danger. Clara understood one thing with certainty. The cabin was no longer just a refuge from rain. It was a place under watch. In Ravenbrook the following morning, Sheriff Miles O'Connor trudged through mud beside his deputy Daniels. The forest canopy dripped steadily above them. Miles bent, fingers brushing blackened ground where a fire had burned recently. "Still warm," he muttered. He straightened, his lined face grim. Whoever camped here wasn't gone long. Nearby lay the remains of wooden crates smashed open and discarded. Rusted tools scattered the ground. Handsaws, wedges, and a battered chainsaw with its fuel tank drained. Miles kicked at one crate, sending shards skittering. "Empty," Daniels noted. "Looks like they've been stripping lumber again." Miles' mouth flattened. The Danner brothers, Caleb and Roy. Their names hung in the damp air like a curse. Miles remembered their faces from too many mugs shot. Caleb wiry with sly eyes that gleamed whenever he lied. Roy Burder, his scowl like a permanent brand. Both dangerous in different ways. Both cunning enough to slip through law's grip when given the chance. "Town won't like this," Daniel said. "They'll blame Granger." The words needed no proof. Rumors had already rooted deep. In the tavern that evening, men hunched over glasses of rye and muttered about the hermit's allies. Women whispered in the bakery line about seeing strange shapes. In the woods near the cabin. By dusk, the conclusion had hardened into gospel. Silas Granger was harboring criminals. "Who else would let them hide out?" one farmer insisted, slamming a fist on the bar. "That light's always burning. What's he signaling?" "He's been trouble since the day he came back." Another replied, "Man like that, full of war and secrets." It was only a matter of time. Miles heard it all as he walked the wooden sidewalks, his boots echoing under the gossip. His instincts told him Silas might be guilty of nothing more than silence. But instinct didn't silence townsfolk. Fear did, and fear was already hunting for a target. That night, back in the cabin, Clara tucked Hazel and Ivy back beneath their blankets. The girls asked questions she could not answer. Who was outside? Were they coming back? Was the light in the window a beacon or a curse? She hushed them with kisses to their damp hair. Yet when she glanced at Silas, standing rigid by the hearth, she read the truth in his pale eyes. Someone was circling them, and it was only a matter of time before the shadows pressed closer. The rain had eased, leaving the forest dripping with 1,000 tiny voices, each branch and leaf giving back what the storm had poured upon it. The cabin in Ravenbrook stood as if washed anew, its damp logs, darker but sturdy, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Inside, warmth spread from the hearth, and for the first time since Claire and the twins had entered its threshold, the place felt less like a hideout and more like a reluctant home. Silas sat by his workbench, a block of cedar held firm in one scarred hand. His knife moved with quiet precision, shaving curls of wood that fell like golden ribbons onto the floorboards. Hazel and Ivy watched with wide eyes, perched on stools too tall for their small legs, their feet swinging as though they were keeping time with the rhythm of the blade. Hazel tilted her head, her honey blonde hair slipping from its ponytail. "What are you making, Mr. Silas?" The man's lips twitched into something between a frown and a smirk. "Not sure yet," he muttered, though his hand seemed certain, guiding. The knife threw the grain with memory rather than thought. Clara stood nearby, drying wet socks by the fire. Her eyes softened as she watched the scene, her daughters leaning forward. Silas bent to his craft, Ranger lying at his boots with his chin flat on the floorboards. The dog's golden brown eyes, once watchful and distrustful, now blinked with a calm acceptance. The sound of the blade filled the silence until Silas finally raised his hand, revealing a small creature emerging from the block. Hazel gasped. A fox! The figure was rough still, its tail curled high, but its shape was unmistakable. Silas held it out without ceremony. Hazel reached for it as if it were glass, her face lit by firelight and awe. Ivy nudged her sister. "You got a fox. Maybe mine will be a deer." Her eyes sparkled with mischief, the same way Clara's late husband's had whenever he told a joke that only half landed. Silas said nothing, only picked up another piece of wood. His knife resumed its whispering work. Soon enough, the shape of antlers began to rise. Clara swallowed the knot in her throat. She had never imagined her children would laugh so freely in a stranger's home, especially one with such a hardened shell. But here they were, tucking the little wooden animals to their chest, as though they had been waiting their whole lives to be given such simple treasures. For a moment, she dared to believe that the forest had not cursed them, but guided them here for a reason. By afternoon, the storm clouds had cleared and pale lights streamed through the dusty windows. Hazel and Ivy played on the rug, making up stories between the fox and the deer. Ranger, ever loyal, lay stretched across the rug, occasionally lifting, his head as if to listen. Each time Silas rose to feed the fire or fetch water from the kettle, the dog's eyes followed him, no longer with suspicion, but with something like respect. Clara noticed. She leaned against the wall, arms folded, studying the way the grizzled man carried himself. His steps were heavy, as though each carried the weight of ghosts. But his hands, those same hands that had once patched the wounds of soldiers, moved gently. When shaping wood or passing the girls their carvings, she spoke softly, careful not to disturb them a moment. "You care for them even if you don't admit it." Silas paused, the knife hovering above the wood, his shoulders stiffened. "Don't mistake kindness for weakness," he muttered. But Clara caught the fleeting softness in his eyes before he turned away. Meanwhile, in Ravenbrook, the air was not softened by the scent of cedar, but sharpened by fear. Sheriff Miles Ockenor walked the length of the town's granary with Deputy Daniels at his side. The wooden doors stood cracked, their heavy padlocks sheared clean by bolt cutters. Inside the floor bore the marks of hurried footsteps, bags dragged across the planks, crates left split, Miles crouched, tracing the scrape of metal against wood. "Fuel barrels gone," he said, "and at least 10 sacks of rice." Daniels frowned. "That's more than just petty theft? Someone's preparing for something bigger?" Miles nodded grimly. He knew exactly who might be desperate enough, bold enough to stage such a raid. Caleb and Roy Danner, two brothers who thrived in the shadows between law and lawlessness. Theirs was the sort of hunger that devoured whatever it touched. Timber, supplies, people's peace of mind. "Mark my words," Miles muttered. "This isn't the last we'll see of them." But suspicion was a double-edged blade. By the time the news reached the townsfolk, tongues wagged in another direction. "Who else lives in the woods?" one man said bitterly at the tavern. "That hermit's always been trouble." They say he keeps a lantern burning at all hours. Another added. Signaling. I bet you signaling those brothers. Fear once planted spread like ivy through brick. By sundown, the talk off Ravenbrook was clear. Silas Granger was in league with the Danners, and the proof lay in the yellow glow from his cabin window. Miles heard these words with a sinking weight in his chest. He trusted his instincts more than gossip, and his instincts told him Silas was not the kind of man to stoop to theft, but instincts did not satisfy a town's hunger for answers. He rubbed a hand over his stubble jaw, muttering, "To Daniels, if I don't keep a close watch on that forest, they'll make Silas into the devil whether he is or not." And so that night, Miles rode his horse beyond the town's edge into the dripping silence of the woods, eyes sharp for the faintest glow of fire. Back in the cabin, Hazel and Ivy finally drifted to sleep, their wooden fox and deer clutched tight in their hands. Ranger lay beside the bed, tail curled, sighing in contentment. Clara stood at the doorway, watching Silas tidy the workbench. She could see the shadows tugging at him, the battle still fought behind his eyes. But she also saw what the girl saw. The man who carved a life from wood, who kept nightmares at bay with fire and silence. She whispered into the quiet room, though she wasn't sure if she meant it for him or for herself. Maybe this place isn't cursed after all. Silas didn't answer, but when the lantern was turned low, the corners of his mouth curved just slightly into the kind of smile only a soldier who had once lost everything could wear, fragile, but real. The storm did not arrive as a whisper, but as a roar. By dusk, Ravenbrook lay under a siege of wind and rain, the kind that clawed at rooftops and tore branches from the forest with merciless strength. Thunder rolled like cannon. Fire across the sky, and every flash of lightning painted the trees in blinding silver before darkness swallowed them again. Inside the cabin, the windows rattled in their frames, though Silas had reinforced them with boards long ago. Hazel and Ivy huddled together under a quilt near the hearth, their eyes wide each time thunder cracked. Clara stroked their hair, murmuring reassurances she herself barely believed. Ranger paced by the door, his ears pry-cricked, muscles taut. His bark erupted suddenly, sharp against the howl of the wind. Silas, sitting in his armchair with a lantern at his side, rose at once. His weather-beaten face tightened. "He hears something?" Clara turned toward him, startled. "In this storm? Who could be out there?" Silas's boot struck the wooden floor with purpose. He grabbed a heavy coat from a peg by the door and threw it on, his frame filling the entryway like a sentinel. "Stay with the girls." But Ranger barked again, more insistent, and pawed at the door. Clara bit her lip, torn between fear and instinct. If someone is out there, they'll die. Silas's gaze flickered toward her, sharp, but not unkind. Then we'd best not let that happen. He opened the door and the storm burst inside, spraying them with icy rain. Clara pulled her shawl close and followed anyway. She could not let him go alone. The forest was chaos, trees bent like old men against the wind, their branches thrashing, rain sheetated down so hard it stung the skin. Ranger led the way, his body low to the ground, his movements urgent but precise. They followed him down a slope slick with mud. Silas kept his hand firm on Clara's arm whenever she slipped. The man moved with the sure-footedness of someone who had walked through worse storms. On foreign soil, though the lines of strain deepened on his brow, Ranger stopped suddenly, barking toward a fallen oak. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the sight beneath. A boy, no older than 14, pinned under the massive trunk. His face was pale beneath the mud, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. Lips trembling as he cried out weakly. Clara gasped, "Oh my God." The boy's eyes fluttered open, desperate. "Help! Please!" Silas knelt without hesitation. His hands, scarred yet steady, pressed against the trunk. He measured its weight, his breath controlled. "We'll need leverage." He scanned the forest floor, spotting a sturdy branch. "Clara, get that." She hurried, dragging the branch over. Together they wedged it beneath the trunk. Silas grunted, muscles straining as he bore down. The wood groaned, but lifted just enough. Clara pulled the boy free, gasping with effort. The child collapsed into her arms, coughing. Clara brushed his hair from his mud-streaked face. His eyes, though blurry, were a familiar green. "It's Ethan," she whispered. "Ethan McCoy. His family runs the bakery." Ethan clung to her, his voice. "I tried to get home before the storm, but the tree." His words dissolved into shivers. Silas shed his coat and wrapped it around the boy's frail shoulders. Without a word, he lifted Ethan into his arms. Clara followed close as they fought their way back through the gale. Back at the cabin, Hazel and Ivy gasped when they saw the bundle Silas carried. Clara rushed to set blankets near the fire. Ethan was lowered onto the rug, shivering violently, his clothes soaked through. "Hot water," Silas ordered. Clara obeyed without hesitation, filling a kettle from the bucket and setting it over the flames. The twins fetched more quilts. They're small, hands eager to help. Ranger lay close, his warmth pressed against the boy's side, as though he understood the importance of his presence. Silas checked Ethan's legs, his fingers methodical, his expression grave but calm. "No breaks," he murmured. "Booed ribs, maybe, but he'll heal." He pressed a cloth to a shallow gash, his touch firm yet gentle. Clara watched, awe mixing with gratitude. For all the whispers about Silas being dangerous, here was a man saving a child with a quiet authority of one who had spent his life mending broken bodies. When Ethan finally drifted into a fragile sleep, Clara knelt beside Silas. Her voice was thick with emotion. "You saved his life." Silas shook his head. "The storm nearly took it. We just stole it back." But when Clara's hand brushed his arm in thanks, he didn't pull away. Elsewhere in the storm-lashed streets of Ravenbrook, shadows moved with purpose. Caleb and Roy Danner, broad-shouldered and mud-smeared, slipped through the alleys like wolves in the dark. Their eyes gleamed with greed. Roy, the younger, carried a crowbar, his jaw set with reckless eagerness. Caleb, taller and more deliberate, kept scanning the corners. His beard was soaked, his flannel shirt clinging to his chest, but this stride was steady. "There!" Roy hissed, pointing at the general store. Its windows rattled, lights extinguished. Perfect cover for men like them. They forced their way in, shoving aside crates, grabbing sacks of flour and jars of oil. The storm's howl muffled their noise, but not enough. From across the square, a lantern flickered. "Hey, who goes there?" Amon's voice called. A villager, brave or foolish, had seen them. "Run!" Caleb barked, dragging Roy out into the rain. Their boots pounded against the soaked earth as they fled toward the tree-line. Behind them, the shouts of alarm rose, carried even through the storm. Sheriff Miles O'Connor was roused within minutes. Mounted on his horse, soaked to the bone, he followed the muddy trail that led out of town. His deputies trailed behind, their lanterns flickering in the gale. Miles's eyes narrowed as he studied the tracks cutting toward the forest. "Danner boys," he muttered. He had no doubt now, and the direction they're in chilled him to his core. They're headed near Gwers's place. The storm swallowed his words, but the resolve in his eyes burned like iron. Back in the cabin, Ethan stirred, whispering weakly for his parents. Clara hushed him, stroking his hair. Silas sat nearby, sharpening his knife with quiet strokes, though his gaze was not on the blade, but on the storm howling outside. Ranger raised his head, ears pry-cricked, as if he too sensed danger approaching. For the moment, though, the cabin was a haven, a boy saved, a family comforted, and a soldier's humanity revealed once more. But beyond the trees, trouble marched closer with every muddy footprint. Morning came slowly after the storm, pale light breaking through clouds like torn fabric. The forest dripped with last night's rain, every branch heavy with water. Inside, the cabin, the fire still burned low, casting a warm glow over the small gathering. Ethan stirred under a quilt, his cheeks no longer ghostly pale, but flushed with faint color. Clara leaned over him, brushing his damp hair back. "You're safe now, Ethan." Silas sat nearby, rewrapping the boy's bandaged arm with careful practiced hands. His touch was steady, his brow furrowed in concentration. Hazel and Ivy sat cross-legged on the floor, watching intently, their fingers clutching the wooden animal Silas had carved for them. Ranger sprawled beside Ethan, the great dog's head resting protectively near the boy's legs. When Silas finished, Ethan blinked up at him, then at Clara. His voice came hoarse but clear. "He saved me, him and the dog. I would have died out there if it weren't for them." Clara's throat tightened at the words, but before she could respond, Ranger's ears shot up. The dog gave a loud growl, then barked sharply toward the door. Silas's eyes darkened. "Visitors," he muttered. Moments later, voices rose outside, angry, suspicious, carried on the damp air. The door burst open and Sheriff Miles O'Connor entered, followed by half a dozen townsfolk clutching lanterns and axes. Rain-stained coats hung from their shoulders, faces pinched with fear and distrust. Miles, tall and broad-shouldered, removed. His hat, his weathered face, framed by a thick gray mustache, bore the calm authority of a man who had seen much and judged carefully. Yet even his eyes flickered with unease as they fell on the scene. Silas standing over a child on a bed, Clara hovering close. Thatwinds pressed together in the corner. "It's true, then," a villager hissed. Athen man with a hawk nose named Vernon. Pike, always eager to stir trouble. He's taken a boy just like we feared. Ethan sat upright, wincing but determined. "No, he saved me. I was trapped. He pulled me free." His voice cracked with desperation, but it cut through the murmurs like a bell. Clara stepped forward, her shawl drawn tightly around her. "What you see is a man who risked his life in the storm for someone else's child. You call that kidnapping?" Here ye's blazed. Hazel and Ivy darted to Silas's side, clutching at his sleeve. "He's our friend," Ivy cried, her small voice shaking. Hazel added fiercely, "Ranger likes him. That means he's good." The German shepherd barked once, loud and resolute, standing tall between Silas and the intruders. His golden-black coat bristled, his gaze sharp as if daring anyone to advance. Miles raised a hand for silence, but tension lingered in the air, thick as smoke. He studied Silas with eyes that searched for truth. "You're saying this boy came to no harm here?" Ethan lifted his chin, weak but unwavering. "If you don't believe me, look at the bandages. Look at Ranger." He pulled at the tree until I could breathe. Please, I stopped blaming the wrong person. The crowd shifted uneasily. Doubt began to ripple through their certainty. Meanwhile, deeper in the drenched forest, two other figures moved with less honor. Caleb and Roy Danner crouched by a thicket, their stolen goods hidden beneath brush. Sacks of grain, tools, and jugs of fuel gleaming with rain. Roy, wiry and restless, spat into the mud. "We lay it near the cabin. Folks will think the old hermit's been thieving all along." His crooked grin revealed yellow teeth. Caleb, older and broader, nodded grimly. "Let the town tear him apart. We slip away with the rest." They hefted their loot. But before they could plant the false trail, Rare's bark echoed faintly through the trees. The dog had caught the scent. With his nose low, he tugged sharply at Miles's sleeve, then darted toward the woods. Miles frowned but followed, lantern in hand. The townsfolk muttered behind him, torn between curiosity and suspicion. Silas stayed by the cabin, unwilling to leave Clara and the children vulnerable. Through the underbrush, Ranger led them straight to the stash. The sacks of flour lay sodden. The crowbar gleamed, and footprints in the mud pointed to only 2 men. Miles crouched, his mustache twitching as he examined the scene. "Well, well," he murmured. "Looks like our storm brought more than fallen trees." The crowd gasped. Vernon Pike sputtered. But it could still be. "Don't fool yourself," Miles snapped, holding up a muddy boot print larger than Silas's foot. "This ain't the work of one old man." At that moment, the Danner brothers emerged, realizing too late they had been cornered. Roy tried to bolt, but Ranger lunged with a thunderous bark, blocking his path. Caleb swung his arm as though to strike, but Miles's revolver was already drawn, gleaming under the gray sky. "Enough!" the sheriff barked. His deputies seized the brothers, binding their hands. Back at the cabin clearing, the truth spread like fire through dry grass. Ethan stood at the doorway, leaning weakly against Clara, his voice carrying despite the wind. "It was Silas who saved me. It's Caleb and Roy who stole from you. You've all been wrong." The villagers hung their heads, shame burning on their cheeks. Vernon muttered an apology, though his eyes still darted uneasily toward Silas. Others shuffled, mumbling words of regret. Miles returned with the bound brothers, his face carved with authority. "The real thieves are caught," he announced, his gaze swept over the crowd, firm and unyielding. "Let this be lesson before you cast stones at the wrong man." Silas stood silent, High's expression unreadable. Yet when Hazel slipped her hand into his, he allowed it to remain. Ranger pressed against his side, tail thumping once as though to declare the matter settled. Clara met Silas's eyes, her own filled with relief. "The truth has a way of coming to light," she whispered. For the first time, Silas's stern mouth softened into something almost like a smile. The courthouse of Ravenbrook stood at the heart of the town, a square stone building weathered by decades of wind and rain. On this particular morning, its steps were crowded with townsfolk, their breaths puffing white in the crisp winter air. The sky above was pale blue, stray with silver clouds, and the snow underfoot crunched as people shuffled forward to see the trial that had set every tongue wagging for weeks. Inside, the wooden benches filled quickly. Lanterns glowed against the old walls, and the smell of pine resin lingered where logs burned in the great iron stove. The air held a mix of anticipation and unease. At the front of the chamber, Judge Harlan Prescott adjusted his spectacles, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy black robe. Prescott was a stern man in his 60s, with thinning hair combed neatly back, and deep-set eyes that missed little. Known for his strict fairness, he was not easily swayed by rumor or sentiment. On one side, Caleb and Roy Danner, their wrists shackled. Caleb, thick-set with a square jaw and eyes like smoldering coals, glared defiantly, while his younger brother Roy fidgeted restlessly, his wiry frame twitching at every sound. Both bore the hard features of men who had lived by greed and cunning. On the opposite side, Silas Granger sat quietly, his weathered face calm but unreadable. Clara seated beside him with Hazel and Ivy between them. Ranger lay at his feet, massive head on his paws, his golden black fur gleaming in the lamplight. The trial began with Sheriff Miles O'Connor presenting the evidence, the stolen grain sacks, the fuel jugs, the tools found hidden in the forest, and the footprints that matched Caleb and Roy's boots. His voice carried steady authority, each word cutting through the whispers of the gathered villagers. Witnesses spoke. The farmer who saw the Danner skulking near his barn, the shopkeeper who discovered his lock broken, and finally, Ethan, his arms still bound, but his spirit unshaken, who told the court how Silas and Ranger had saved him. Roy tried to protest, sputtering excuses, but Caleb silenced him with a growl. Their lawyers' half-hearted attempts at defense faltered under the weight of testimony. When the judge finally called for silence, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Judge Prescott's gavel struck like thunder. "Caleb Danner and Roy Danner, this court finds you guilty of theft, conspiracy, to defraud, and attempted defamation of an innocent man. For your crimes, you are sentenced to 12 years imprisonment at Hardwick Penitentiary." Gas rippled through the crowd. The brothers cursed, their faces contorted with rage, but the deputies pulled them away in chains. As they were dragged from the chamber, Roy's eyes darted frantically, but Caleb kept his gaze locked on Silas, hatred simmering even in defeat. Then the judge turned his gaze toward Silas. His voice softened, though it carried clearly. "Silas Granger, you stand cleared of all suspicion. You have endured unjust blame, yet still acted with honor. This town owes you gratitude." For a long moment, the townsfolk sat in silence, many lowering their eyes in shame. Then slowly heads lifted. Applause began hesitantly from one corner, then spread until the chamber filled with the sound of clapping hands. Hazel grinned up at Silas, and Ivy clapped with all her might, her eyes sparkling. Clara's smile trembled with pride and relief. Even Ranger gave a sharp bark as though punctuating the judgment. Weeks passed, and Ravenbrook transformed beneath the hush of winter. Snow-blanketed rooftops and fields and lanterns glimmered warmly through frosted windows. The townsfolk busied themselves with preparations for the winter festival, an annual gathering of music, trade, and celebration meant to chase away the cold's long shadows. On the evening of the festival, the village square came, alive. Strings of lanterns glowed like captured stars, and laughter echoed among the stalls, where merchants sold spiced cider, woven scarves, and roasted chestnuts. Children dashed between games while fiddlers played lively tunes that stirred the frosty air. This year, however, there was a new stall set against the backdrop of the square, a simple wooden table draped in cloth, upon which stood a collection of carved animals, birds, and small figurines. Bears with solemn faces, deer mid-leap, owls with wings half spread, all shaped from polished wood that gleamed golden under the lanterns. Behind the table stood Silas Granger. His posture was still straight, his expression still reserved, but the shadows that had once cloaked him seemed lighter. Clara stood nearby, her auburn hair tucked beneath a woolen bonnet, watching him with quiet encouragement. Hazel and Ivy darted between the table and the crowd, proudly showing anyone who would listen the little carved foxes and rabbits Silas had gifted them. When villagers approached, they came not with suspicion, but with awe. An elderly woman traced her fingers over a carved lark and whispered, "So delicate." A blacksmith admired the strength in a bear's shoulders. Parents bought carvings for their children, and children lingered by Ranger, who lay calmly on the snow-dusted cobbles, letting them stroke his thick coat. His presence, once feared, now symbolized trust. Hazel tugged at Silas's sleeve. "They like your animals," she whispered, her eyes shining. Ivy added, "See? They know you're good now." Silas looked down at them, his weathered face softening. "Maybe," he murmured. "Maybe it's time to stop hiding." Clara's smile widened, her voice low but certain. It always was. As the night deepened, music swelled, and lanterns swayed in the winter wind. The laughter of children, the warmth of neighbors, and the quiet pride in Silas's eyes would together into something Ravenbrook had not known in years: healing. The cabin on the edge of the forest was no longer a place of dread, but of memory, of kindness, of rescue. And for Hazel and Ivy, who clutched their carved animals while they danced in the snow, it was proof that even the darkest woods could yield light. In the end, this story reminds us that miracles often arrive in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes, God sends his light not through grand signs, but through the quiet courage of a stranger, the loyalty of a dog, or the laughter of children who still believe in hope. Just as Silas found redemption in a new family, we too are invited to see that no heart is ever too broken to be healed. May this tale inspire you to look for God's grace in your own daily life, in the kindness you give, the forgiveness you extend, and the faith that carries you through storms. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, hope, and redemption. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace and protection.